You actually think you can beat me, boy? The words hung in the air like poison as Sheikh Khalid al-Rahman leaned back in his Italian leather chair, a cruel smile playing across his lips. The morning sun glinted off the crystal chess pieces on the marble table between them, each piece worth more than most people earned in a year. Across from him sat 10-year-old Marcus, the son of his housemaid Elena, his small hands folded calmly in his lap, his dark eyes fixed on the board with an intensity that should have warned the millionaire, but arrogance is a powerful blindfold. The invitation had come 3 days earlier, on a Wednesday morning when Elena was scrubbing the floors of the East Wing. Sheikh Khalid had been entertaining business associates when he noticed Marcus sitting quietly in the servants' quarters, studying something intently. When he looked closer, he saw the boy was hunched over a worn paperback book about chess openings, his finger tracing the diagrams with careful precision. The sight had amused him greatly. Here was this child, living in the servants' quarters of his palatial estate in Riyadh, thinking he could understand the game of kings. It was too perfect, too delicious an opportunity to pass up. He would invite the boy to play, let his associates watch as he demolished this presumptuous child, put him firmly in his place. It would be entertaining, a bit of sport before lunch. His friends would love it, this little display of the natural order of things. Marcus had accepted the invitation with a quiet nod, much to his mother's horror. Elena knew the kind of man Sheikh Khalid was, had seen him humiliate others for sport, had watched him destroy business rivals with the same casual cruelty he might swat a fly. She begged Marcus to decline politely, to claim he was too nervous, too unprepared, anything to avoid this trap. But Marcus had simply squeezed her hand and said, "It's okay, Mama. Trust me." There was something in his voice, something ancient and knowing beyond his years, that made her step back even as her heart screamed warnings. The chessboard was set up on the terrace overlooking the gardens, where Sheikh Khalid's associates could watch comfortably from cushioned chairs, sipping Arabic coffee and eating dates. There were 6 of them in total, other wealthy businessmen who had come to discuss a property development deal. They whispered among themselves as Marcus approached, this small boy in his simple blue polo shirt and khaki pants, walking past manicured hedges and fountains that cost more than entire houses in the neighborhood where he and his mother had lived before coming to work here. The contrast was stark, intentional. Sheikh Khalid wanted everyone to see it, to understand the gulf between them. "Do you even know how the pieces move?" Sheikh Khalid asked with theatrical concern, as Marcus sat down, his voice dripping with false kindness. His associates chuckled appreciatively. Marcus said nothing, simply reached forward and moved his king's pawn forward 2 squares. The classic opening. His hand was steady, his face calm. Sheikh Khalid's smile widened. The boy had some basic knowledge then, enough to make this interesting, enough to make the inevitable crushing defeat all the more satisfying. He responded with his own pawn, and the game began. What Sheikh Khalid did not know, what he could not have known because he never bothered to see his servants as full human beings with their own stories, was that Marcus had been studying chess since he was 5 years old. His father, before he died, had been a janitor at a community center where a chess club met every Saturday. Young Marcus would sit in the corner watching the games, absorbing everything. The old men who played there, retired teachers and postal workers and mechanics, noticed the silent boy with the hungry eyes. They started teaching him, showing him tactics and strategies, letting him play against them. When his father passed away from a heart attack 2 years ago, those men had pooled their money and bought Marcus books, proper books with annotated games and theory. They could not give him much, but they gave him knowledge. And knowledge, Marcus was about to prove, was the greatest weapon of all. The game progressed. Sheikh Khalid played confidently, aggressively, moving his pieces with flourish and commentary. "You see," he said loudly for his friend's benefit, "this is called the Italian opening. Very classical, very strong. Perhaps too sophisticated for a beginner." Marcus simply nodded and responded with a move that made one of the watching businessmen, a man named Ibrahim, who actually knew chess, sit up straighter in his chair. It was a subtle move, a knight to the edge of the board that looked passive but actually controlled key central squares. Ibrahim said nothing, but his eyes narrowed with interest. By move 12, Sheikh Khalid's smile was becoming forced. The boy was not collapsing, not making the obvious blunders he had expected. In fact, the position on the board was becoming surprisingly complex, with tensions building in the center. Sheikh Khalid had a slight advantage in development, but somehow his pieces were not coordinating as well as they should. He could feel sweat beginning to form on his brow. Despite the morning coolness, this was not how it was supposed to go. He was a member of the Royal Saudi Chess Association, had learned the game at an elite boarding school in Switzerland, had a rating that put him in the advanced amateur category. This child should be no match for him. Move 18 was when everything changed. Marcus had been building pressure slowly, so slowly that Sheikh Khalid had not noticed the trap being constructed around him. His queen was slightly out of position. His king's defenses had imperceptible weaknesses. His pieces were tied down, defending each other. And then Marcus moved his rook to the 7th rank, a quiet move that suddenly made the entire position collapse for Sheikh Khalid. He stared at the board, his mind racing through variations, and realized with dawning horror that he was losing, not just losing, but getting crushed, systematically dismantled by a 10-year-old boy. His friends had gone silent, leaning forward to see the board, Ibrahim now openly smiling. "Perhaps we should stop here," Sheikh Khalid said, his voice tight, reaching to reset the pieces. "You have done well for a beginner, very impressive." But Marcus spoke for the first time since the game began, his young voice clear and firm. "The game is not over, sir. It would be disrespectful to my father's memory to not finish what I started." The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a judgment. Sheikh Khalid's face darkened. He had been given an exit, a way to save face, and this child had rejected it. His pride, already wounded, now bled with rage. "Very well," he said coldly. "Let us continue." 7 moves later, it was over. Checkmate. Marcus's queen and rook had woven a mating net so elegant, so perfectly constructed, that Ibrahim actually applauded, a slow clap that echoed across the terrace before he caught himself. Sheikh Khalid stared at the board as if it had personally betrayed him, his face cycling through shades of red and white. The other businessmen shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to react. They had come to watch a child be humiliated, to reinforce their own sense of superiority, and instead they had witnessed their host demolished by someone they considered beneath notice. Marcus stood up and extended his hand across the board for a handshake, as his father had taught him to do after every game, win or lose. "Thank you for the game, sir," he said quietly. Sheikh Khalid looked at that outstretched hand like it was a serpent, and then, in front of everyone, he swept his arm across the board, sending the expensive crystal pieces flying across the terrace, some shattering against the marble floor. "Get out," he hissed. "Get out of my sight, you and your mother both. You are fired. Pack your things and leave my property within the hour." Elena, who had been watching from the doorway to the house, her hands clutched to her chest, let out a small cry. This was exactly what she had feared. They would be homeless now, jobless, all because of a chess game, all because a powerful man's ego could not bear being beaten by a child he considered inferior. Marcus walked calmly to his mother, took her hand, and together they went inside to gather their few belongings. Behind them, they could hear Sheikh Khalid shouting at his servants to get them out, to never mention this morning to anyone, his voice shaking with humiliation and rage. What happened next would become legend in certain circles. Ibrahim, the businessman who had watched the game with growing interest, followed Marcus and Elena inside. He was a quieter man than his associate. Wealthier, actually, though he did not flaunt it as obviously. He owned technology companies, invested in education initiatives, and unlike Sheikh Khalid, he recognized brilliance when he saw it regardless of its packaging. He found them in their small room, Elena crying quietly as she folded their clothes into a battered suitcase. "Excuse me," he said from the doorway. "I watched your game. Where did you learn to play like that?" Marcus explained about his father, about the men at the community center, about the books they had given him, and the hundreds of games he had studied by candlelight while his mother worked late shifts. Ibrahim listened, his expression thoughtful. When Marcus finished, Ibrahim handed Elena his business card. "I have a scholarship program," he said, "for talented young people who need opportunities. If you are interested, call my office tomorrow. We provide education, housing, everything needed to develop gifts like your son's. I believe Marcus could be something extraordinary with the right training." Elena stared at the card, as if it might disappear, as if this might be another cruel trick. But Ibrahim's eyes were kind, genuine. "Call tomorrow," he repeated. "I mean it." Then he left, returning to collect his things from the terrace, where Sheikh Khalid was still ranting about disrespect and uppity servants who did not know their place. Ibrahim announced he was leaving, that he had other appointments. He did not mention what he was thinking, which was that he had just seen a preview of the future, and Sheikh Khalid was not in it. Marcus and Elena did call the next day, from the phone of a sympathetic neighbor who had taken them in. The scholarship program was real, more than real. Ibrahim arranged for Marcus to attend one of the best international schools in Riyadh, with full boarding and a stipend for Elena, so she could stop working multiple jobs and finish her own education. He connected Marcus with a chess grandmaster who had retired to teach, a Russian man named Petrov, who took one look at Marcus's games and agreed to take him on as a student. For the next 8 years, Marcus trained rigorously, not just in chess but in mathematics and logic, and all the disciplines that fed his gift. At age 14, Marcus became the youngest Arabian Chess Championship finalist, losing in a close match, but impressing everyone with his tactical brilliance. At 16, he won the GCC Youth Championship, crushing opponents from elite private schools and royal families. At 18, he earned simultaneous acceptance to MIT for mathematics and an invitation to train with the world's top chess players for the candidates tournament that determined who would challenge for the world championship. He chose to pursue both paths, studying during the academic year and competing in the summer. Throughout all of this, Elena watched her son grow not just in skill, but in character. The humiliation on that terrace had not made him bitter, had not turned him cruel. Instead, it had clarified his purpose. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be considered less than human because of circumstances of birth and economics. He never forgot, and he never let anyone else forget either. He spoke openly in interviews about his mother cleaning floors, about the old men in the community center, about systemic barriers and the talent that society overlooked because it wore the wrong clothes, or spoke with the wrong accent, or lived in the wrong neighborhood. Sheikh Khalid, meanwhile, did not fare as well. The property deal he had been discussing that morning fell through when Ibrahim quietly withdrew his funding, mentioning only that he had concerns about judgment and character. Other deals began to sour as word spread in business circles about the chess game incident. Ibrahim had not spread it maliciously, but he had mentioned it to a few people as an example of wasted potential and toxic arrogance. And in the interconnected world of Gulf business, such stories traveled. Sheikh Khalid found himself slowly frozen out of the most prestigious deals, relegated to smaller ventures. His fortune remained substantial, but his reputation, that intangible thing he had valued above almost all else, was tarnished. The final chapter came 5 years after that morning on the terrace. Marcus, now 23 years old, had been invited to give a simultaneous chess exhibition at a luxury hotel in Dubai, playing 40 games at once against local players as a fundraiser for educational charities. The event was covered by international media, a young prodigy who had risen from poverty to compete at the highest levels. Among the 40 participants who had paid substantial entry fees for the privilege of playing against him was Sheikh Khalid, older now, his face harder, his arrogance tempered by years of small failures and social decline. When Marcus reached Sheikh Khalid's board during the exhibition, walking from table to table, making his moves, there was a moment of recognition. The older man's eyes widened and then narrowed. "You," he said quietly. Marcus looked at him calmly, that same intense focus from his childhood, now honed by years of competition. "Good evening, sir," Marcus said politely. "Shall we play?" There was no gloating in his voice, no revenge, just professional courtesy. The game lasted 32 moves. Marcus played simply, efficiently, and when he announced checkmate at Sheikh Khalid's board, he did so respectfully, even as cameras flashed around them. After the exhibition, as Marcus was signing autographs and speaking with young students about chess and education, Sheikh Khalid approached him, his pride finally broken enough to allow for something resembling honesty. "I underestimated you," he said simply. "That was my error." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, and then said something that would be quoted in articles about him for years to come. You did not underestimate me, sir. You never estimated me at all. You saw only what I looked like, where my mother worked, and decided that was all there was to see. That is a bigger error than any chess mistake. It is an error of the soul. The words were not cruel, not delivered with anger, just stated as fact, as truth. Sheikh Khalid had no response to that. He simply nodded once and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, a diminished figure finally understanding the cost of his arrogance. Marcus watched him go, and then turned back to a young girl who was asking him about chess tactics, giving her his full attention, seeing her not as a distraction, but as a person deserving of respect and knowledge. This, more than any championship or rating or brilliant combination, was his true victory. The ability to remain human in a world that constantly invited him to become something less. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing, so this channel can reach more people like you. Now, back to the story. Elena stood at the edge of the room, watching her son with tears in her eyes. The boy who had sat calmly on that terrace, who had trusted himself even when she was terrified, had become a man who changed lives, simply by refusing to accept the limitations others tried to place on him. The chess game that morning, 13 years ago, had not been about pieces on a board, not really. It had been about dignity, about worth, about the fundamental truth that brilliance wears no uniform and genius asks no permission. Marcus had proven that truth then, and he proved it every day since, not through revenge or destruction, but through excellence and the quiet revolutionary act of being fully, unapologetically himself. The game, in the end, was never really about chess at all, but about seeing clearly. And in that most important game, Marcus had already won before the first piece was ever moved.